Very good morning from Downing Street to viewers on BBC One and on the BBC News Channel. Should that be welcome back once again to Downing Street on the day the United Kingdom gets its third Prime Minister in the space of just 7 weeks. In about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, Rishi Sunak will be driven through the gates and he'll take office here, becoming the first British Asian, first person of colour to take the highest political office in the land. We'll bring you all the events of the morning live here on BBC One, and we'll be looking at the enormous challenges that Mr Sunak will be facing with the help of our correspondents here in Westminster, as well as around and beyond the United Kingdom. So let's take you through what today is likely to look like. The current Prime Minister, Liz Truss, is holding her fourth and final cabinet meeting right now. It started about an hour ago at 9 o'clock. She's due to make a statement outside number 10 at around 10:15, so not long to go, before travelling to Buckingham Palace for a final audience as Prime Minister with the King, with King Charles III. After that, Rishi Sunak will be heading to the palace, where he'll be invited to form a government. And then it's back to Downing Street, and the new Prime Minister will address the nation at around 11:35, we think. And then over the next 24 hours or so, we can expect to see a trickle of cabinet appointments, which will start to shape what Rishi Sunak's government will look like. Of course, not just appointments, but message too. What is the message likely to be when he appears at that podium, which has just been put up behind us outside number 10. So first of all for Liz Truss, and then for Rishi Sunak later on. And keeping us company throughout the morning as we follow these events is our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley, who's with me now. Nick, the podium's up, just went up a few minutes ago. Liz Truss, first of all, let's just talk a little bit about the fact that this is her fourth and final cabinet. Will that be just a matter of saying goodbye to people and thank you? Or will there be any real business transacted at that cabinet?
I wouldn't have thought so, because 7 weeks to the day since we last stood here and watched Liz Truss arrive, she's basically ending in failure. The last 7 weeks have been nothing like what she planned. And normally what happens is a Prime Minister comes out and tells us all what they think their achievements were and tries to start to draw the picture of their own legacy. It's going to be very hard for Ms Truss to do that. She might talk about national insurance and the fact that they reversed the rise in national insurance. She might talk about energy costs and the fact that a cap was put in on the price. But let's face it, the big things that Liz Truss told us 7 weeks ago that she wanted to do, growing the economy, bringing tax down, rewriting the economic rule book, they haven't worked, and this premiership is ending in failure.
Is there any element of sympathy on a personal level for her? I mean, there's lots of anger, given that people are saying, well, she put in place policies which caused turmoil for the country, leave alone if you talk about the interests of the Conservative Party. Is there any sympathy on a personal level for what she's gone through?
Yes, I think there is. And I think some politicians would talk about the human toll that this sort of thing takes. But I think all of that is inevitably overshadowed by the political legacy, which is one that makes the economic backdrop today even bleaker than it was 7 weeks ago, and makes the job her successor is going to have to do is, when they get into number 10, when Rishi Sunak gets into number 10 this afternoon, it's going to make that job even harder.
Well, when she leaves, as you say, we'll see what the message is. She will then go and see the King at Buckingham Palace. There'll be that final audience as Prime Minister. There was that rather odd moment in the previous audience when the King greeted Liz Truss and said very audibly, oh dear, or words to that effect. A sense there that he also knew that she was in a spot of bother.
One of the things we were told about that is that it's something of a verbal tick. I think the palace was quite conscious that it didn't want to be seen to be interfering in politics so early. But it's strange, isn't it? Because when we stood here 7 weeks ago, we saw the final transition of power that Her Majesty the Queen oversaw. Well, the King has only been in charge and the head of state for 6 weeks now, and already he is going to have his second Prime Minister. Quite a moment for him as well. But look, for Liz Truss, she spent her whole political career thinking that there was a different way you could run the economy, different way you could run power. This afternoon, the people who agreed with her, who thought that she was onto something, who believed in her political vision, would accept that it's ended badly, and they're worried that they've lost the argument for a generation.
Viewers are seeing the images from Downing Street, Nick, as we're talking, and again reflecting the fact that there's interest among the media, not just in the UK, but worldwide too. Lots of talk, for example, overnight in terms of the international reaction to Rishi Sunak's election. We were talking to some of our colleagues in the US about the Biden administration. And, of course, we were talking to our correspondent in Delhi about the reaction there, given the heritage that Rishi Sunak and the family represents. So we should underline once again today that this isn't any old transition. This is a transition, actually, that signifies something of a major milestone in British politics.
It does indeed, because the third female Prime Minister is being replaced by the UK's first non-white Prime Minister, the youngest Prime Minister as well, for a couple of centuries. Rishi Sunak's only 42 years old. He's only been in Parliament for 7 years. So, yes, look, it is a really big moment. Whether it changes the political weather, let's wait and see, because Rishi Sunak does, his economic vision is very different. How he engages with Europe, with the United States, with former Commonwealth countries will be really interesting to see, because he shares a lot of the kind of Brexit supporting ideology that Liz Truss had. I don't think he'll want to be seen by his own party to be too close to the European Union, so that might not change dramatically. But yes, certainly in terms of his connections to India, that's a really significant milestone. Their Prime Minister very, very encouraged, he said, to see Mr Sunak taking the reins of power in London.
We're going to pause there for a second, Nick, because we've been talking about the fact that, of course, there'll be two journeys to the palace today. We'll be looking at Liz Truss making her way over there to Buckingham Palace, not far away beyond St James's Park, and of course then Rishi Sunak as well later, when he's invited by the King to form a government. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell is at Buckingham Palace to talk us through the events that we're expecting there, Nick.
Hugh, yes, good morning. 7 weeks to the day since we last saw this process playing out, of course, on the Tuesday, the 6th of September. On that occasion, it was all up at Balmoral because of the frailty of the late Queen Elizabeth, when she, in her last formal duty, received the resignation of Boris Johnson and invited Liz Truss to form a government. Well, this morning, the choreography will be repeated, as you've been describing. Rather more straightforward in logistical terms, given that it will take place here at Buckingham Palace, which at the moment is enjoying this rather beautiful autumn sunshine here in London. But at 10:30, Liz Truss will make her way to Buckingham Palace, and she will tender her resignation to King Charles, the first time, of course, that he's presided over this important function of the British monarch. And then at about 11 o'clock, Rishi Sunak will be making his way to Buckingham Palace. He will have a private audience with the King. He will not, we think, be accompanied by his wife, but the King will invite Rishi Sunak to form a government. It is one of the last prerogative powers of the monarch, and I think in point of fact we may be seeing the King just moving up from Clarence House. Yes, the King moving from Clarence House, where he still resides, to Buckingham Palace. I imagine it must be him. Yes, that looks like very much like the sort of vehicle in which King Charles travels. So let me just move out of the way, and we can see the King arriving at Buckingham Palace in preparation for the audience which will take place later this morning. And as I was saying, it will be at about 11 o'clock that Rishi Sunak will arrive at Buckingham Palace, and he will be shown into the audience room, and the King will invite him to form a government. And just a reminder of the criteria that applies in situations such as this. The British Prime Minister is somebody who must command the confidence of the House of Commons. That's how it works in our parliamentary democracy. So the British Prime Minister would, by convention, be the leader of the largest party in the House of Commons. And although the outgoing Prime Minister, in this case Liz Truss, will offer advice to the King as to whom he should call to form a new government, it is an area that's known as the royal prerogative, and in theory the monarch can choose whoever he or she wishes to form a government, but by convention it would be this person who can command the confidence of the House of Commons. So that is what will happen here at around 11 o'clock. Rishi Sunak will be invited to form a government, and it is only at that moment, of course, that he becomes Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and at that moment he will then, of course, return to number 10 Downing Street, which will become his home, and he will make that statement in front of the door, as you will witness where you are.
Nick, many thanks. Nick Butchell there for us, our royal correspondent at the Palace, and good timing there to see His Majesty arriving at the Palace, ready for the two audiences that will be held today, making his way from Clarence House down to Buckingham Palace. First of all for Liz Truss, who's going to appear here within a few minutes, and then, of course, later for Rishi Sunak. Let's take a look at the door of number 11 Downing Street, because then you'll see the gathering of staff, including the Deputy Prime Minister Therese Coffey. There you can see the crowd in front of number 11. They've come out in readiness for the Prime Minister's outgoing statement. And then, of course, we will have a group of people coming along to support Rishi Sunak as he is installed as Prime Minister too. So as soon as Liz Truss is out in Downing Street, we will be taking every word of that. Nick Eardley is still with me. And Nick, a traditional site.
It is very different, though, to what we had a few weeks ago when Liz Truss arrived, when the street was packed with her supporters, packed with MPs, packed with ministers who would support her in power. A sign, I think, of the fact that the political mood has changed so dramatically. I can see just at the bottom of the street, out of shot, Jacob Rees-Mogg, the current business secretary, one of Ms Truss's loyal supporters. He is in the street, but outside the door of number 11, no politicians apart from Therese Coffey, one of Ms Truss's most loyal allies. The political weather changes quickly, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And I'm just wondering, looking at Therese Coffey there, with the staff who are with her, you know, if you go back a few weeks, did they ever imagine in their worst nightmares that they would be on their way out? You know, barely 6 or 7 weeks later. You do wonder, with all the young advisors there who are with them too, all of whom came in with a sense of excitement and ambition, and this is where we are.
They all thought this was their moment. They thought that they could change the political and the economic weather with some dramatic tax cuts, some dramatic changes of economic orthodoxy. And they believed that it would be the start of a new economic era. That's exactly what Liz Truss promised. Instead, the fact that those tax cuts were unfunded, the fact that the economic market reaction was so dramatic to Ms Truss, it's all ended in tears, it's all ended in failure, and we're about to see, addressing the nation for the last time, the shortest serving British Prime Minister in history. It's remarkable to think that it's only been 7 weeks that all this has happened in, but it has been the most dramatic fall from grace in British political history.
So the final preparations have been made, Nick, and we can see that the prepared remarks have been put on the podium, on the lectern, ready for Liz Truss to appear. The team is outside number 11 Downing Street, and of course there'll be hundreds of Conservative MPs watching. There'll be thousands of Conservative members watching. There'll be millions of voters watching this, because of course the change today isn't just about, you know, the kind of political battle internally for the Tory party. Decisions will be made in the next few days and weeks which will affect the livelihoods of millions of people up and down the country who are concerned about rising fuel bills, who are concerned about the cost of living. So much as this is a kind of political battle here, it resonates very strongly across the UK.
it's hard to exaggerate the level of challenge that Rishi Sunak will face when he arrives here in a couple of hours' time. The economic turbulence that we've seen in the last few weeks, inflation, the cost of living crisis, the war in Ukraine, adding to all of that, he really has to hit the ground running. And I think that as a former Chancellor, Mr Sunak will understand just how significant it is to make quick decisions. It's a week yesterday, 6 days' time, that we're expecting to hear a form of budget from the current Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. We're not certain if he'll stay in his job. I think there's a good chance of that, though, in terms of stability, keeping Mr Hunt in the job. But the new government has to decide extremely quickly what spending cuts it's prepared to make, what constraints on the public purse it's prepared to countenance, and what tax rises might be coming. 7 weeks ago, Liz Truss stood at that very lectern and told us all the big tax cuts were coming. That was the Conservative plan to boost economic growth. What we're about to see in the next few days is the exact opposite. The economic backdrop has changed. Mr Sunak is going to have to agree to spending cuts and to tax rises.
Well, everything now in Downing Street, all eyes fixed on the door of number 10, waiting for the conclusion of that cabinet meeting. I suspect it's over by now, and I suspect that what's happening now, Nick, is that Liz Truss is thanking officials, those officials who have been at her side for the last few weeks. Of course, some senior civil servants as well, including the Cabinet Secretary, who've been trying to guide government policy during a period of crisis. The door is opening, and Liz Truss emerges with her husband and daughters for the last time as Prime Minister.
It has been a huge honour to be Prime Minister of this great country, in particular to lead the nation in mourning the death of Her late Majesty the Queen after 70 years of service, and welcoming the accession of His Majesty King Charles III. In just a short period, this government has acted urgently and decisively on the side of hard-working families and businesses. We reversed the national insurance increase. We helped millions of households with their energy bills and helped thousands of businesses avoid bankruptcy. We are taking back our energy independence, so we are never again beholden to global market fluctuations or malign foreign powers. From my time as Prime Minister, I am more convinced than ever that we need to be bold and confront the challenges that we face. As the Roman philosopher Seneca wrote, it's not because things are difficult that we do not dare. It's because we do not dare that they are difficult. We simply cannot afford to be a low-growth country where the government takes up an increasing share of our national wealth, and where there are huge divides between different parts of our country. We need to take advantage of our Brexit freedoms to do things differently. This means delivering more freedom for our own citizens and restoring power to democratic institutions. It means lower taxes so people can keep more of the money that they earn. And it means delivering growth that will lead to more job security, higher wages, and greater opportunities for our children and grandchildren. Democracies must be able to deliver for their own people. We must be able to outcompete autocratic regimes where power lies in the hands of a few. And now more than ever, we must support Ukraine in their brave fight against Putin's aggression. Ukraine must prevail, and we must continue to strengthen our nation's defences. That's what I have been striving to achieve, and I wish Rishi Sunak every success for the good of our country. I want to thank Hugh, Francis, Liberty, my family and friends, and all the team at Number 10 for their love, friendship and support. I also want to thank my protection team. I look forward to spending more time in my constituency and continuing to serve South West Norfolk from the backbenches. Our country continues to battle through a storm. But I believe in Britain. I believe in the British people. And I know that brighter days lie ahead. Thank you.
Prime Minister Liz Truss, in her final statement in office as First Lord of the Treasury, leaving with her husband Hugh and 2 daughters, and a statement that tried to combine, I suppose, acknowledging what she felt were some of the limited achievements, and then an expression of regret as well for what had not been possible. So I suppose trying to make the best of what everyone would agree is, from her point of view, an extremely disappointing job for what other people would see as a real failure. Nick Eardley still with me. What did you make of the tone of that, Nick, and the content?
I'd attempt you to put a positive spin on what's happened over the last few weeks. You know, Liz Truss talking about the action the government did take on energy bills ahead of winter, that it did take on reversing the national insurance increase. Interesting that Ms Truss did still talk about believing in a low tax economy,
yes,
something she wanted to deliver, but the way she did it caused economic turmoil, didn't it? And interesting there, just towards the end, pledging to stay on as a backbench MP and to support the new Prime Minister from the backbenches in the House of Commons. That will mean that we have both Ms Truss, Boris Johnson and Theresa May still in the Commons. I think that's the first time ever that we've had 3 former Prime Ministers still serving in the Commons.
I think that's probably right, Nick. I mean, you'd have to go back in the history books, and I can't think of a time when there would be another 3 former Prime Ministers. 2 certainly, but not 3. These are the scenes above Whitehall in central London. The sun's now out, and it's a much nicer day than it was when it started earlier. When we arrived, it was rather wet. The sun is out, and the Prime Ministerial cavalcade is on its way up Whitehall, switching lanes, and everything's been cleared in terms of the access towards, probably towards Trafalgar Square, we think, and then up to Trafalgar Square to turn left down the Mall and along to Buckingham Palace there. So a grand processional route which is very familiar to those of you who follow all the big state occasions. There we are through Parliament Square with Lord Nelson surveying the scene from Nelson's column, and Trafalgar Square bathed in lovely sunshine through Admiralty Arch and then down along the Mall. Admiralty Arch, of course, which was one of the important parts of the government's own property portfolio in central London, but was sold a few years ago and is being redeveloped. Along the Mall, which is still looking rather green in October, and along past the flank of St James's Park on the left-hand side, and then the Clive Steps on the right-hand side, all the way down, and then past Clarence House, which of course the King and the Queen Consort were where they were staying last night, and they've just made their way, as Nicholas Witchell was telling us, to Buckingham Palace for these 2 audiences. They came back to London especially for this purpose, and the King therefore is waiting in Buckingham Palace to give an audience, a final audience, to Prime Minister Truss. They'll meet again, I'm sure, in different contexts, but a final audience as Prime Minister for Liz Truss. Maybe they'll reflect on the last few weeks and the difficulties that they've already been discussing in the previous 3 audiences. And then, of course, there'll be a gap of a few minutes. It's all done rather efficiently. It'll be like clockwork. Then we'll see Rishi Sunak being taken to the palace almost immediately, where he will be having an audience with the King and will be invited by the King to form the new government following his election as leader of the Conservative Party. So it'll all happen very quickly, and it's only when that audience takes place and the King and Mr Sunak shake hands that Mr Sunak will formally become Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury. That's the moment it happens. And that, by the way, is the reason why lots of heads of state around the world haven't actually put out a formal statement yet to congratulate Mr Sunak, because they're waiting for this audience to take place, because in strict terms of protocol, they are waiting for him to become formally named as Prime Minister. So there they go, into the famous quadrangle inside Buckingham Palace there, over to the visitors' entrance, where they'll be escorted up to the first floor to meet the King. And the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason, is watching these images with me. And Chris, we were just underlining earlier, we think what's happening today, the shortest serving Prime Minister in British history, going in to resign, the first Prime Minister of British Asian origin, the youngest for 200 years. It's a day of many milestones.
It is a day of many precedents, a day of many milestones, and yet such has been the turbulence in British politics on an unprecedented scale that there's a familiarity, isn't there, to this constitutional choreography that we're witnessing as the Prime Minister, for she is still that for just the next couple of moments. Liz Truss arrives at Buckingham Palace for this audience with His Majesty, her husband following as well. Worth sparing a personal thought, I think, regardless of your politics, for Liz Truss this morning, reaching just 7 weeks ago the ultimate pinnacle of British politics, achieving an ambition that so many in this postcode aspire to and so many don't achieve. She managed that, and yet so quickly, with such efficiency and such ruthlessness on the part of her backbenchers, she has been dispatched. A conclusion from her party that her programme for government was simply untenable. And then, as you say, a new Prime Minister within the next half hour or so, as Rishi Sunak comes in for his audience, and so many unprecedented moments, or at least moments that you have to go a long, long way back into history to find a precedent for, with his arrival. Firstly, his age, the youngest Prime Minister since Lord Liverpool in 1812. The first Prime Minister of British Asian origin. And then he confronts you a colossal in-tray. Now, I know we were saying this just 7 weeks ago about Liz Truss. He faces all of those same challenges on top of the huge challenges as a result of what's happened in the last 7 weeks. Bluntly, the fact that people are having to pay more for their mortgages, the fact that people are perhaps less comfortable with the idea that government can be stable and in their interests. That's the first thing he has to try and convince people when he addresses the country here in just over an hour's time.
Quite a few people have gathered at the gates of the palace there, as we can see, Chris, because they are aware of what's going on today. So, especially for those people who are tourists visiting London, they've got something rather important to be witnessing, which is above and beyond possibly what they were expecting when they arrived. So they're getting extra value for money.
Indeed.
But while we chat, Chris, and while we look at these images, I'm going to bring in the Conservative MP, Alicia Cairns, who's the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Alicia, thanks for waiting patiently to talk to us. What is your reading of what's happening today?
Look, I think it's really important that we all admire those who step forward for public service, and we give Liz our thanks. You know, she brought in magnificent support to help people with energy bills. She did help businesses get through, and she has started that process towards moving towards energy resilience. But now we need to look forward, and I think what the country wants to see when they're scared at a time of global instability is fiscal responsibility, pragmatism and compassion. And I do believe that that is what we will see with Rishi Sunak.
Interesting talking to a few of your colleagues, Alicia, recently, literally in the last few days. One saying to me, well, you have to have sympathy with Liz Truss because what she's been through is a very difficult experience. And then another of your colleagues saying to me, I have no sympathy at all. She made an absolute hash of things and really did increase problems for people up and down the country. Where do you stand?
Look, I think anyone and everyone feels for Liz Truss. I think all of us recognise she's had an enormously difficult time. But I think the challenge was that she came forward wanting to bring in a bold agenda. But the fact is, as I mentioned, at a time of global insecurity, people didn't want to see free market dogmatism. The markets weren't prepared, the markets weren't ready. The markets aren't woke or leftist. This was them expressing genuine concern about the model that's being put forward and the £130 billion of tax cuts that weren't funded. So that's what we want to see a shift away from now. We want to see that kind of, as I said, fiscal responsibility, that pragmatism, that compassion. And I think the unity of the Conservative benches over the last, I've lost track, 12 hours, 20 hours, is really strongly felt.
Alice, thanks very much for talking to us. We'll see what transpires when Mr Sunak arrives a little later, but thanks a lot. Conservative MP Alicia Cairns, who's the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. There we are, the glorious scene of Green Park and St James's Park over Buckingham Palace there, and the gardens of Buckingham Palace just on the left-hand side, which Her Majesty, her late Majesty, used to love walking around. Nicholas Witchell, my colleague, our royal correspondent, is there, and the cars have gone in. Nick, so what's going to be happening now?
Well, the audience will be taking place, Hugh, in the 1844 room. Liz Truss went in at 10:25, a few seconds after that. Now, we won't know when she leaves because by tradition, an outgoing Prime Minister leaves privately. She will therefore leave by a private exit from Buckingham Palace. But generally, these audiences, I think, take about 15-20 minutes. The first part of that will be entirely private, when, as Prime Minister, she offers her advice as to who the King should then call on to form the new government, and then tenders her resignation. After that, as we saw, her husband Hugh O'Leary was with her, and I think their two daughters also accompanied them to the palace. So normally the family then would have a few moments with the monarch, in this case King Charles, before it will then be time for them to depart. And the careful choreography, the police, the special escort group, will then be bringing the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to Buckingham Palace. And I remember not so many years ago when Theresa May was arriving to take over from David Cameron, the two motorcades almost collided at the gates of Buckingham Palace. So anxious was Theresa May to get there on time. But generally, as I say, these things are very carefully managed. The outgoing Prime Minister leaving privately, the new Prime Minister, the Prime Minister-to-be, arriving also to go up to that audience room where he will be invited then by the King to form a government.
A remarkable start to the reign, Nick, as we were reflecting earlier. The King, of course, having acceded to the throne on the Queen's death not so many weeks ago, and already on his second Prime Minister, something that no one could have imagined. How candid do you think this exchange of views will be in the audience, this final audience with Liz Truss today? What is your sense of how open that discussion might be?
I think King Charles, being the person that he is, will wish to express sympathy and support at a human level, because Liz Truss, whatever one thinks about the politics of all of this, has been through a pretty traumatic few weeks, seeing all her policies come apart in the way that they have, having to resign 7 weeks to the day after she was invited to form a government by Queen Elizabeth. So I think that King Charles will not wish to go into the details of what went wrong and why. I think preeminently he will wish to express sympathy to her and ask how they are going to go forward from here as a family. I think in general terms he will want to talk about the overall situation, because as monarch he is bound to have considerable interest in and concern for the state of the country, but that perhaps is a conversation that he will pursue with greater sense, in greater detail, with the incoming Prime Minister. And certainly it would be entirely within the bounds of convention for him to discuss with the new Prime Minister what are his plans. As sovereign, he has the right to be consulted, the right to warn, and the right to encourage. So notwithstanding that he is such a new monarch, he has many years of experience in public life, and he will, I'm sure, be exercising that right as monarch in the way that his mother did for so many years with 15 different prime ministers.
Nick, we're keeping an eye, obviously, for the arrival of Mr Sunak, but for now, thank you very much, Nicholas Witchell, our royal correspondent. And while we are keeping an eye on these images, of course, we were talking there to Nick about the exchange between the monarch and the outgoing and then the incoming Prime Minister, and to what extent that will be candid and touch possibly on what needs to be done in the next few weeks and months. by Mr Sunak. So with all of that in mind, let's talk to Professor Sir John Curtice of the University of Strathclyde, who joined us kindly. John, it's quite a day to be witnessing events here at Westminster. What is your guidance to viewers on what Mr Sunak is facing when he walks in through that door in, well, is it about an hour's time?
Well, the honest truth is he's probably facing a combination of policy challenges and political difficulties that are as great as any previous new Prime Minister has faced. The most immediate obvious challenge, of course, is to steady the government's fiscal finances while trying to minimise the damage to an economy that's probably heading for recession. And when many people are facing declining living standards, and for those who are less well off, potentially serious poverty during the course of the winter. But at the same time, he is inheriting a party which has been internally deeply divided, partly over some of the policy issues, including over Liz Truss's attempt to dash for growth, but also one that is now badly behind in the opinion polls. It's around 30 points or so behind Labour. And knowing that no previous government that has presided over a fiscal or financial crisis of the kind that we had over the last month has managed to win the ballot box at the next general election. So this is a very, very formidable set of challenges that he faces. Now, one thing he's got going for him, perhaps, is that the public are inclined to the view that he might make a good Prime Minister. They certainly were more likely to think that in the polling that was done in the last few days than of either Boris Johnson or Penny Mordaunt, his two possible competitors. But even so, but when next week we discover how tough the economic medicine is, we may already begin to see people expressing concern and disenchantment about some of the decisions that he's find himself forced to make.
Just a quick other point, if I may, John, just before we go back to Buckingham Palace, because we're expecting Mr Sunak. Just a thought, just to develop the thought that you referred to there, which is the work that's been done so far on trying to project what kind of electoral effect a Sunak premiership might have on the Conservative Party. You're saying that the early signs are that it's possibly quite positive, or what?
Yeah, I think we can expect, given not at all the fact that the Conservatives are so far behind in the polls, that there will be a modest honeymoon boost for Mr Sunak, which was entirely absent in the case of Ms Truss. For example, his favourability rating from YouGov came out yesterday. He's still unpopular, but at minus 28, it's an awful lot better than the minus 70 to which Liz Truss had descended by the end of her administration. So I think we've also had a certain amount of hypothetical polling asking people how they would vote if Mr Sunak became Prime Minister. For what it's worth, it helps to narrow the gap. So I think the expectation has to be, in the short run, something of a narrowing of the Labour lead, but not necessarily on a scale that's going to get the Conservatives any close to being competitive with Labour again. And then after that, the honeymoon boost is fine for the beginning, but then thereafter comes the hard work of restoring his party's seriously tarnished reputation for economic competence, and indeed being able to provide stable and effective government more broadly.
John, good to talk to you as ever. Thank you. Professor Sir John Curtice there of the University of Strathclyde. We're just having a look at these aerial images here, just behind Downing Street, I think, and the Treasury there, and that's St James's Park. Chris Mason, our political editor, still with me. We're in this part of the proceedings, Chris, where we're trying to spot cars from the sky,
Indeed.
Which is never an easy game to play. But on the other hand, we are expecting Mr Sunak to be driven into Buckingham Palace before long. And I don't think, as Nick Witchell was telling us, that we will see Liz Truss leaving. Normally that is a more discreet affair.
Indeed so, because at that point she returns to being, well, a private citizen. Yes, still a Member of Parliament, as she said here just 15 minutes or so ago, but at that point she is no longer Prime Minister. And right now, as we're in conversation, one of those conversations in politics that has the highest sanctity, a conversation between a Prime Minister, in this instance an outgoing Prime Minister, and a monarch. Those audiences that prime ministers have so often cherished down the generations, because it is pretty much the only conversation they can be fairly confident won't leak and won't appear in either my notebook or tomorrow morning's newspapers a matter of moments later. An extraordinary moment for the two of them, really, a new king and a new prime minister, conducting this valedictory audience far sooner than I suspect either would have anticipated just a matter of weeks ago, and then a king who has been on the throne for just a matter of weeks welcoming his second prime minister in the next half hour or so, and then the briefest of moments, and these moments are intentionally incredibly brief for obvious constitutional reasons, where the country is without a prime minister as Liz Truss leaves from one door at Buckingham Palace, and then Rishi Sunak's motorcade arrives and he heads in for his first audience with the King as Prime Minister, and is asked to form a government. That constitutional moment where a king invites along the leader of the biggest party at Westminster who can command a majority in the House of Commons, because that, under our constitutional system, is how you are invited to form a government.
Oh, to be a fly on the wall.
Indeed.
In both audiences.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, given what Mr Sunak had to say in that statement yesterday, that rather short statement, where he used a phrase which suggested that the economic challenges would require extremely difficult decisions, which some people immediately assumed meant that he would be announcing possibly some very significant spending cuts or other decisions which would cause pain and cause alarm for people. One wonders in this audience whether he will have to outline to the King the kind of difficulties that he's going to be facing, because, as you say, the whole point about the audience is that they can share some of the concerns in confidence.
Indeed, and the King will be able to reflect on those confidential conversations that he's had with the outgoing Prime Minister over the last few weeks and the difficulties that she has encountered, in the hope, I suspect, from the King's perspective, that the new Prime Minister can avoid similar banana skins, really. So, yeah, the economic picture is without question the central question that the new Prime Minister will have to answer, not least, who does he have as his Chancellor of the Exchequer? Now, the expectation probably is that he will retain Jeremy Hunt, but we can't be certain of that. The other expectation is that he will press ahead with this economic statement scheduled for next Monday. The second half of that budget, effectively, some of which was hauled forward by Jeremy Hunt just a matter of days ago. And as you say, at the heart of that is this expectation of either spending cuts or tax rises, or a combination of the two. Now, politically, that's difficult, but never mind the politics. What really matters there is the impact it has on people's lives.
Indeed.
The impact that it has pretty instantly, really, at a time of profound concern for so many.
So that really leads me to the next question, which is what kind of cabinet will Rishi Sunak want to have around him to discuss those kinds of policies, to get unity around them, when frankly the party will be quite divided on some of those ideas. I mean, ideologically very sensitive to them in some areas. You do wonder what kind of team he wants to build around him.
Yeah, and it's really, really difficult, this, and it'll be the first indication of how he intends to govern, because he's going to talk, and he is emphasising the need for stability for obvious reasons, given what's happened in the last few weeks. But then his initial actions in reshaping his team will illustrate just how committed to that or not that he is. Were he to decide he wanted his own pick for Home Secretary, we'd have our third Home Secretary in a week. So does he leave Grant Shapps there or not? There's the question, as I say, about the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Does he leave Jeremy Hunt in post? What about the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, who over the weekend, as late as Sunday afternoon, was endorsing Boris Johnson to be the next Prime Minister, not Rishi Sunak. But Mr Sunak emphasises that he wants to govern where he can respect the broadest tent of Conservative opinion. So does he leave someone like Mr Cleverly in post, or does he keep him in cabinet, move him to somewhere else and bring someone like Penny Mordaunt, who's twice now run for the leadership in just the last couple of months and is seen as something of a rising star within the party? So the personalities around that cabinet table and how radical he is willing to be at a time when there is a desire for stability, you immediately see the kind of contradictions that he will face, the tensions that will pull him this way and that, in just those opening hours in office, because we expect, as soon as this afternoon, confirmation of who will hold at least the major offices of state, and then perhaps over the next couple of days a greater sense of the full formulation of his government.
OK, Chris, let's pause for a second there. The audience started 20 minutes ago, the audience between Liz Truss and the King over at Buckingham Palace. So my sense is that if it's not ended, it's probably coming to an end right now. But as I said, we probably won't see Liz Truss leaving the palace. But we're certainly keeping an eye on the traffic to see Mr Sunak being driven to the palace. And while we wait for that to happen, I'm going to bring in Anita Boateng, who served 3 cabinet ministers as a government special advisor from 2016 to 19, including the Deputy Prime Minister in the Cabinet Office, Lord Chancellor, Work and Pension Secretary, so lots of experience. Anita, very good of you to join us, thank you. What's your reading of how this transition is taking place today?
Well, it's the age-old dance of the move from one Prime Minister to another, so both will be fairly used to seeing it on their screens and obviously experiencing it for the first time. But behind the scenes in Number 10, you'll have all sorts of things going on, such as the former special advisors saying their goodbyes, because it has been a fairly short period of them being at the helm, but oh my goodness, look at all the things that have happened. So that team will have been bonded through those difficult situations, and then you'll have the new and incoming team to come in and welcome Rishi Sunak. There's often lots of energy and jubilation in those moments, but I think that nobody in that team is in any doubt about the scale of the challenge that they face, not just in settling the economic situation, but providing that political stability within the party to ensure that the UK can navigate these very choppy waters.
When the new Prime Minister sets about announcing the new team, Anita, given what you know of how these things work behind the scenes, how much of that work will have been done already?
Well, I think the kind of cabinet we could have expected from Rishi Sunak if he had won in the first leadership contest of this year would be quite different to the one that we'll see now. I mean, he has said very clearly to the party when he was elected yesterday that he wanted to bring in sort of lots of different talent from across the party, and 12 years into Conservative leadership, there are a lot of people, former ministers on the backbenches, junior ministers looking for a promotion, and cabinet ministers wanting to stay in post. So I don't think there is a way for him to satisfy all of those needs. But as Chris said, I think you're really going to get a sense of how Rishi Sunak is going to govern, of his priorities, and also of how he's going to manage the party through this reshuffle. I think it is going to be an incredibly difficult decision, and there will be, as always with reshuffles, moments of pain, because there will be people that will have been hoping for a job that won't be, and therefore will become more difficult to manage as the more controversial measures roll in.
How do you think he'll approach the issue of trying to convince millions of voters, many of whom are already under great pressure with the cost of living, that spending cuts are possibly necessary, more of them, or possibly even some tax rises in some areas? It's going to be an extremely difficult message to sell people who are already feeling the pinch. Isn't that right?
Absolutely, but Rishi Sunak has proven himself to be, in my view, a consummate communicator, not just throughout the pandemic, but when he was making some of those very difficult decisions post-pandemic. I think he fronted up to them and was very direct with people about some of the difficult decisions that had to be made. And I think that has been something that's been consistent throughout his parliamentary career and his time in high office. So I don't think he's going to shy away from some of those challenges and some of the sacrifices that will have to be made to put the finances on a sustainable footing. I think in Jeremy Hunt as a Chancellor, I mean, we wait to see whether that will be confirmed, but I think they have a similar approach to communication in terms of being straight up, being reassuring, and being diligent in how they think about making those decisions. And that compassionate conservatism, I think, will run throughout this premiership.
Anita, very good to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us. Anita Boateng, the former Conservative Special Advisor in the Cabinet Office. Our thanks to Anita. This is the scene in Whitehall, and those are the gates to Downing Street. A fairly small crowd having gathered there outside the gates just to see what's going on. Lots of them, as I came in earlier, are basically curious tourists, just aware that there's a changeover happening in Downing Street today. A bit of a mix of people, but it's clearly a matter of some curiosity. The crowd will build when they realise that Rishi Sunak, the new Prime Minister, is to arrive here within the next probably half hour, 40 minutes or so. But he has to go over to Buckingham Palace before then for that audience with the King, where the King will invite him to form the next government. Which he's now in a position to do, given the fact that he's been elected leader of the Conservative Party, and that party is the party with a solid majority in the House of Commons. So that's how the system works. The monarch inviting the person who has the best hope of commanding a majority in the House of Commons, and that person right now, given his election yesterday, is Rishi Sunak. These images are showing you just Downing Street running off Whitehall there, and then the little warren of buildings and rooms and offices which form 10 Downing Street. All we see is the front door usually, but behind the front door, a network of offices, and then the wooded area of the garden behind number 10 and number 11 and number 12 just to the left-hand side there, all of them part of the network of senior government buildings, and of course the Prime Minister, the Chancellor's official residence, and then it loops around to the Cabinet Office on Whitehall, the Cabinet Office, which is in many ways the machine at the heart of government. It's the coordinating department, if you like. And then you have that wonderful expanse of Horse Guards Parade, which is just there beyond the garden of Downing Street. Horse Guards Parade, where the birthday parade for the monarch takes place every year, and it's just flanked there by the Horse Guards building, and then the old Admiralty building, old Winston Churchill's old office on the top end there, on the as we're looking at the screen now, on the top end of the parade ground, and the great view there of the River Thames with the London Eye there. A familiar sight with the Household Cavalry making their way along the Mall towards Buckingham Palace, I think, because we're approaching 11 o'clock and it's probably time for changing of the guard at the palace today. But these are the troopers of the Life Guards in their scarlet tunics, and they are making their way down towards the palace itself, along Birdcage Walk, and then along the Mall itself towards Buckingham Palace. And all of this on a day when Britain is marking another milestone in terms of political history, because in Downing Street, which is just beyond the buildings here, we're seeing the little removal van, which has just moved in, probably taking just a few of the belongings of Liz Truss out from number 10 and taking them away. Normally it's a bigger van, Chris Mason, but clearly in this instance possibly there's less to move.
Well, indeed, there may have been there was a limited window, wasn't there, for all of their possessions to be moved from whether it was their home in Greenwich in South East London or indeed the constituency in South West Norfolk. You need a little more than an overnight bag for 7 weeks, but
it's a compact van, let's call it that, shall we?
Indeed,
compact van, which is taking some of the possessions away, and indeed we'll see probably a kind of an exchange move later when some of the Sunak family possessions are brought in from one of their many residences across the UK, because of course one of the themes about this new Prime Minister, which people tend to dwell on, is the fact that of course he is extremely wealthy, and there are people, including some Conservatives that you speak to, who wonder whether he can convince people that he understands what households are up against, given his own circumstances.
Yeah, and I think there will be an element of that sort of biographical fact about the new Prime Minister that will be quite awkward for him, particularly in the political context that he confronts. Yes, there have been occupiers of Downing Street in the past who, by any kind of conventional metric relative to the average earner, have been well off, but the Sunak family is on an entirely different scale. Now, there will be those who will say there should be a pride attached to that about his success, the success of his wife and her family, but there is no doubt that there will be some who will say, to what extent can he truly feel the economic reality of so many families at the moment when we see the cost of living spiralling for basic goods in the supermarket or at the petrol pumps, when he is of such colossal wealth. It'll be very interesting to see the extent to which, as soon as tomorrow at Prime Minister's questions, that the opposition parties may attempt to try to make something of that. But even stepping back from his own family's wealth, the political challenge of what lies for him just around the corner on that economic question is huge, absolutely huge, as he attempts to bind his party back together in a way that just allows him to function as a Prime Minister, because that wasn't possible for Liz Truss, as we saw rather spectacularly. It's the basic building block of being able to govern, not even convincingly, just to function day to day. If he can't do that, the job will be impossible. Even if he can do that, it'll be profoundly difficult for all of the reasons that we've been discussing.
Because I suspect, Chris, we'll be talking almost immediately about values and the values that inform decisions. So within this great economic challenge that he faces, there will, of course, be questions about, let's say, foreign aid. Let's say, for example, defence spending, and the fact that lots of his backbenchers still insist that, despite the circumstances, there is a pledge there to increase defence spending. So there will be questions, and those decisions that are made will be a reflection of the Prime Minister's own values.
They will, because to govern is to decide, and to govern is to prioritise, particularly at a time of limited means as far as the machinery and money at the heart of government is concerned, given the outlays that have already been set out recently connected to the pandemic and then connected to this huge energy intervention. The other thing, in addition to values, Hugh, is character. The character of his government. We saw there the authentic character of Liz Truss in her valedictory address. There was a defiance there, despite everything, that she was absolutely of the view that whilst her prospectus for government clearly didn't work, what motivated her, that drive for economic growth, was still there, burning brightly as she departed, just as it was as she arrived. So what tone will Rishi Sunak strike when he appears at the lectern in the next hour? What shape will his government take when he formulates his cabinet in the coming hours? And then, as you say, in values terms, what are his priorities, and what are the things that he might say diplomatically he still believes in, but are for the future rather than for now? And of course, all of that on this shrunken timetable that he confronts, just because of the reality of the length of this Parliament. He has maximum a couple of years before he has to face the electorate. And of course, right now at least, the Conservatives' poll ratings are, I was going to say on the floor, they are several floors down, a couple of floors down into the basement really. He has to try and haul them back into a place where they can believe they are competitive again.
Let's take a look at central London again. This is the area around Admiralty Arch, where we expect possibly to catch a glimpse of Rishi Sunak when he's on his way to Buckingham Palace. We were talking earlier to our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell, who's keeping an eye on things at the palace for us. And Nick was expecting the audience to last maybe 15 or 20 minutes. I'm not sure whether we're in a position to get a quick update from Nick at this point. But if we can, maybe Nick will be able to tell us whether he understands the audience has finished yet.
Yeah.
So, Nick, can you tell us what you know?
Hugh, we're not being told anything officially, but then we rarely are. But certainly at 10:54, so 4 minutes ago now, we did spot a Range Rover which was, I think, identical to the one in which Liz Truss arrived, just quietly going out through the North Centre gates there without any police outriders and all that sort of thing. Now, whether that was her vehicle, we do not know for certain, but certainly 4 minutes ago, a vehicle which looked as though it might have been hers did depart. And of course, we're beyond the stage now where you have that curious choreography of vehicles, with an outgoing Prime Minister arriving at Buckingham Palace with all the panoply of a Prime Minister, with the armoured vehicle and the outriders, and then having to swap over to their own private vehicle, a kind kind of old banger which then slipped out of Buckingham Palace. That doesn't happen anymore. An outgoing Prime Minister wouldn't get the outriders and all of that, but they would leave here still in the same vehicle that they arrived in. The other thing, of course, is that the incoming Prime Minister is already under the protection of Scotland Yard. We saw that yesterday in terms of the vehicle in which we saw Mr Sunak at Central Office, Conservative Central Office, and the protection people who were with him. But what we don't know, of course, is the direction in which they will be bringing him from. So all eyes at the moment, as you say, being kept to ensure that if and when I should say, Mr Sunak does approach Buckingham Palace, we will get a sight of him. But he would be due. It's 10:59. We're coming up to 11 o'clock. So I think within the next couple of minutes we must expect that the incoming Prime Minister will be arriving at Buckingham Palace, where he will be greeted first of all by the King's Private Secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, who will show him up to the 1844 room where King Charles will be waiting, and King Charles will invite Mr Sunak to form a government. So within the next couple of minutes, I think we can confidently say that that is what we will be witnessing.
Nick, many thanks. Just been handed a statement as well, which is that Elizabeth Truss MP had an audience of the King this morning, tendered a resignation as Prime Minister, First Lord of the Treasury, which His Majesty was graciously pleased to accept. So that is the official confirmation from the Palace that the audience has taken place and that Liz Truss has tendered her resignation. So we now await the arrival of Rishi Sunak at the Palace to be installed. And of course, one of the things that's remarkable and notable about this installation of a new Prime Minister is that he is the first British Prime Minister of British Asian background. And we were talking yesterday to our colleagues in India, in Delhi, about the response there. So let's go back to my colleague Rajini Vaidyanathan, who's been gathering the reaction and response. We were talking yesterday, Rajini, and you mentioned an element of pride in the fact that Mr Sunak has achieved what he's achieved so far. Talk us about the response during the last 12 hours or so, and what kind of relationship people expect to be able to form with Prime Minister Sunak.
Well, on that first point, Hugh, as we're watching here in India, the events unfolding outside Buckingham Palace, Downing Street today, a lot of people in India are seeing this through a very different lens. Now, I mentioned this yesterday as well when we spoke, Hugh, about the historical context here. This is 75 years since India gained independence from British rule. And many people see the election, or the introduction now, I should say, of a British Indian Prime Minister, the first Hindu, who's going to be in Downing Street, number 10 Downing Street, as a huge symbolic moment in terms of rebalancing that relationship. And I mentioned yesterday some of the headlines, Hugh, that talked about the Indian sun rising over the empire, about how history has come full circle. More headlines today in some of the papers talking about the Rishi Raj and talking about how that relationship is now slightly different. And Rishi Sunak in the past himself, when he's given speeches about the relationship between India and the UK, has described it as an equal partnership. And there is some hope that once he's installed as the new Prime Minister, that much awaited trade deal could move forward, because it's stalled. It was supposed to be completed by yesterday, as you may remember.
Rajini, thanks very much. We'll be back to you later, Rajini, if we can, because we're just looking at the images from Whitehall. I think that's the old Admiralty building, actually. I may be wrong. That's just off Whitehall. And that's where the new Prime Minister, incoming Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, is being taken from. There we are. The vehicles on their way. Yes, the old Admiralty building onto Whitehall and up along the same route then that Liz Truss was taking, through Trafalgar Square and through Admiralty Arch down to Buckingham Palace. So they're on their way. The incoming Prime Minister, the second Prime Minister of the King's new reign, is on his way to the Palace to be asked by His Majesty to form a government. And what a day for the Sunak family. When you think of their background, when you think of their history in terms of being the grandparents, being immigrants from East Africa, of Indian origin. The first Hindu Prime Minister. We're going to be talking a lot about the Prime Minister's faith and the role that that plays in his life. So many aspects of today's events and today's appointment which will be poured over in the days and weeks to come. With me, Chris Mason, our political editor, and our economics editor, Faisal Islam. And Faisal, as we look at these images of the new Prime Minister making his way to see the King, it's just a good moment again to reflect on the fact that the happiness and pride which they will understandably be feeling will no doubt be tempered in some way by the scale of the challenge that he faces.
And it's a challenge in an area that the soon-to-be Prime Minister has warned about. I mean, it is quite extraordinary, not just the timing of you having been here 7 weeks ago doing the same thing for Liz Truss, but that before that, just days before that, the now incoming Prime Minister was warning precisely about some of the things that transpired. Now, he hasn't said much, and he certainly hasn't said, "I told you so," but he must be thinking that, and that must be conditioning how he now wants to carry out his duties, because he has a tough economic task, but he's Prime Minister now. I mean, one of his first things is he, yes, we think that Jeremy Hunt's going to remain as Chancellor, but the temptation of a former Chancellor moving into number 10 is to be your own Chancellor, you know, but it's a very different job. And certainly when Gordon Brown did that direct move from number 11 to number 10, some criticism that he continued to micromanage like he was still in charge of the Treasury. So we will get some clues, I think, in the appointments of the Cabinet as to what sort of Prime Minister he will be. But this challenge, I think, is so important. We've seen the news this morning from the Statistics Office about the huge rises in the price of food, everyday goods. And these are the sorts of challenges that he will have to address.
Into Buckingham Palace through the main gates, the central gates there, and Rishi Sunak being taken through to the visitors' entrance and probably up to the same room that Nicholas Witchell was telling us about earlier, the 1844 room where the King will be waiting to grant the audience to the incoming Prime Minister. So the audience with Liz Truss lasted at least 20 minutes, probably 25 minutes. And this one, I suspect, will last a good 20 minutes. We were expecting Mr. Sunak to be arriving in Downing Street in half an hour's time. So if this lasts until about 11:30, well, then it'll just take them 3 minutes or so, 4 minutes, on clear roads to come from the palace over to Downing Street. But here we are, being greeted by the Query and the other Royal Household staff. Our first glimpse today of Britain's incoming Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak greeted by senior officials from the Royal Household, along with Mrs. Sunak. And into the palace via the quadrangle and up to the first floor to that audience room, which has already been used once today with Liz Truss, and now will be used again for the new Prime Minister, the incoming Prime Minister. And still with me, Chris Mason, Faisal Islam, and just a note on this point, Chris, as we see for the first time today, Rishi Sunak, a glimpse of him going in there, such a daunting moment as well.
A daunting moment, a moment of triumph, and just an extraordinary moment for him personally, given that just a matter of weeks ago he'd been plunged into the political wilderness, considering his future, wondering what his political future, if he had one, would amount to. I think was photographed on a plane to Ibiza to have a little bit of time out after the rigours of the campaign over the summer, defeated by Liz Truss as he was then, having been seen as the likely runner-up for the entire time of the conversation that the two of them were having with Conservative Party members. Yes, he had set out very candidly over the summer what he saw as the weaknesses of Liz Truss's economic prospectus, and as Faisal was reflecting on a few moments ago, he has not yet said out loud in public, "I told you so," but that thought must have crossed his mind, because to an extent his economic analysis of the summer was vindicated by the reality of the early autumn. But it's his problem now, or at least it will be within half an hour. How does he grapple with the problems that Liz Truss inherited from Boris Johnson, but then ladled onto the top of that the additional problems that Liz Truss has handed on to him? Not least, as so many of our viewers will be very well aware, the additional mortgage costs associated with what's happened in recent weeks, the ongoing state of the economic statistics that Faisal was speaking to just a couple of moments ago. They are hugely profound economic challenges, and would be at a time of political stability. And of course, he cannot guarantee that. I was struck last night talking to Conservative MPs that they were falling over themselves to say, we've really got to be united now. Well, déjà vu. They were saying that 7 weeks ago. And I think what's changed since then is the Conservative Party has stared over the precipice of oblivion and seen just how bleak it would be were they to leap over it. And I think they now know that they have to be, if they're going to have a future, bind together, because the challenges of government would be huge for Rishi Sunak if he can hold his party together. They'll be impossible if he can't. We know that because we know what happened to Liz Truss. We know what happened to Boris Johnson. But those challenges of being united and being stable begin when he tries to form a government, bringing various elements of the Conservative Parliamentary Party together at a time when most of those cabinet ministers, even the most long-serving, had only served for the 7 weeks that Liz Truss was in office. Some, like the Chancellor and the Home Secretary, for just a matter of days.
We're talking about the long-awaited statement, fiscal statement, Faisal, and that, of course, is due next Monday. You have a relatively new Chancellor in place, so there's a big decision there about whether that person stays, whether Jeremy Hunt stays. And of course, given the sensitivities around the markets and the way that they have responded to the way government has been conducting itself in the last several weeks, if that statement is postponed or for whatever reason is put off, they again risk making people rather jumpy, don't they?
I think that you would have conventionally thought that. I think Rishi Sunak, given his warnings and given his track record as Chancellor, probably carries enough trust from the markets and credibility from the markets for him to have some options now. I think clearly sticking with the same Chancellor and sticking to the timetable would be stability. But he may be tempted to have an extra week or two to own this moment. I don't know. They've been very, very tight with information and briefings. This is some speculation. I think that option is available to him. To give you an example, those charts that I've been showing on the 6 and 10 o'clock news about the effective cost of borrowing are now nearly back to where they were, not on the morning of the mini-budget, but the evening of the mini-budget. So they've recovered. Now that's not just a vote of confidence. It also has a tangible impact on some of those mortgage costs. Eventually it should. And the question is, can they continue in that vein? The tough decisions are still there to be made and have to be made at some point in the next couple of weeks. But I think that they'll be happy with how this has been greeted in the markets already before he's even made a decision or even actually become Prime Minister.
How well do they get on, the new Prime Minister and the Chancellor? Do we know?
They have known each other for a long time. I think, broadly speaking, what we saw from Jeremy Hunt in that sort of shredding of the economic orthodoxy of Liz Truss was something relatively akin to where Rishi Sunak's economic argument was over the summer. I don't hear of any personal tensions between the two of them. I think Jeremy Hunt will be very keen, if he can, to carry on in that post. I think it was quite striking reading the subtext of a tweet that he posted last night congratulating Rishi Sunak on his appointment, that he couldn't be certain that that was what was going to happen. Here comes the lectern. Here it comes again. It's a new lectern. It's a different lectern. Yeah. The kind of Jenga-style lectern, of the base unit of Liz Truss's lectern of choice has gone. We've gone back to a more
solid one.
Yeah, well, a more traditionally designed lectern with the government crest on the front of it, awaiting the new Prime Minister.
Well, there you go. That is the evidence, the visual evidence that things are happening. The new Prime Minister is, as we speak, just a mile or so away in Buckingham Palace, being asked by the King to form a new government. And this tells you that, and all the paraphernalia in the street will tell you, and the world's media gathered around us, will tell you that the arrangements are being made for the new Prime Minister to speak as he arrives and to set out maybe in rather more detail and maybe in a slightly different way to yesterday, where we had a statement from him which was relatively brief and pretty kind of matter of fact. I think today's will be possibly delivered in a different tone and will strike a different note, but we'll see, of course, we'll see. But you'd expect some kind of signal there as to the vision that will underpin Mr Sunak's premiership. He is, of course, the former Chancellor, and one challenge for him will be, as Faisal's been saying, and Chris too, how he handles the economy. So let's talk to the Bank of England's former Deputy Director for Monetary Policy, Professor Sir Charlie Bean. Sir Charlie, thank you so much for waiting patiently to talk to us. What is your take on the challenge and some of the decisions that will need to be taken within hours, possibly, of the Prime Minister's arrival here?
Well, the first thing he obviously has to do is decide who his Chancellor is going to be. There is a very strong case for sticking with Jeremy Hunt. He and Sunak seem to be aligned in the way they view the challenges, and Hunt has made a very good start in terms of clawing back some of the damage that was done by the mini-budget. So we've seen bond yields come down substantially, and that has a direct consequence on not only the cost of government debt, but also feeds through ultimately to the cost of mortgages and things like that. But beyond that, of course, there's really two challenges. The one is the nearer term challenge of just dealing with the spike in the price of energy. The government had introduced the energy price guarantee, but Hunt has indicated that he thinks it's appropriate to try and reduce the cost of that as we go into next year. And the design of that is going to be a challenge. Exactly who bears the burden of higher energy costs and so forth. But in some ways, the bigger challenge is the medium-term one of filling what is now thought to be a 30 to 40 billion pound a year hole in the public finances. It should be said that the decline in bond yields and actually interest rates at shorter horizons as well automatically will help to fill a significant chunk of that hole. So we're probably nearer to the 30 billion rather than the 40 billion. But beyond that, there are going to be difficult decisions to be made as to whether it's going to be filled by higher revenues, which could obviously mean higher taxes, but there are other ways of enhancing government revenues too, or whether it involves a further squeeze on public spending. And remember, the existing cash limits, which were set a year ago, haven't been adjusted for the higher inflation we've seen over the past year. So they already imply quite a significant squeeze on the public sector. So Sunak and whoever his Chancellor will be are going to have to make some difficult decisions there. I think the crucial issue, there's a menu of things that he can choose from, but the crucial thing will be whether Conservative MPs, who are now all talking about unity, but when it comes to actually being faced with particular measures that they don't like, are they going to support them, or are we going to see them reverting to the chaotic infighting that we've seen recently?
All of those are fascinating thoughts, Professor, and hopefully we'll get some answers to them, some of them anyway, in the next few hours or so. But Professor Bean, thank you so much for talking to us there from College Green, not far from Downing Street, not far indeed from Buckingham Palace, where the audience is taking place between Rishi Sunak and the King, where that invitation is being extended to form a new government, after which the new Prime Minister, formally installed, formally appointed, having shaken hands with the King, will be making his way. And the Royal Standard flying proudly in the breeze above Buckingham Palace. That, of course, is the evidence to the world that the monarch is in residence. It was the Union flag earlier, but that was replaced by the Royal Standard as soon as the King arrived from Clarence House to Buckingham Palace a short while ago. So as we look at these images, our economics editor Faisal Islam is still with me. And Faisal, I wanted to ask you as well, given your heritage, what is your take on this moment for the British Asian community?
I'm sure that the new Prime Minister, the incoming Prime Minister, won't want to make a big deal about it. And I don't really want to make a big deal about it, but it is pretty incredible to think that somebody from recent immigrant background is in right now with His Majesty the King. I know they don't formally kiss the hand, but, you know, accepting that mandate to be Prime Minister of this country, it is a moment of history. We haven't seen it in a major European country. I mean, I think we have seen it in Ireland and Portugal, but I don't think in France or Germany or Italy they're even close to having a moment like this. And that doesn't mean there are plenty of our viewers that will not back his politics. Yeah. And we've been through the ringer in this country over the last few weeks and months. But I think it's something that the system has allowed to happen that we can be proud of, that in a major country, somebody from whose parents, grandparents came from another country have come through and will be standing at that podium and will be Prime Minister. It is an extraordinary historical moment. And as I said, amongst the sort of G7 European countries, hasn't happened. And I don't think France, Germany, Italy, they're not even close to it. Frankly don't think there are any people doing my job in France, Germany and Italy who would be doing this. So that's not to say that everyone should give him a free pass. You know, he's a politician of certain views and people will back that or not back that. Yeah. But it's definitely noteworthy, though I don't think he's going to make a big deal of it.
I'm sure you're right. And the fact is that I think that even those who are viscerally opposed to his political outlook and to the policies that he may well put in place, and indeed his policies as Chancellor, lots of people will want to recognise that it's a reflection, a good reflection on the UK that someone with his background can make it in that sense.
Well, and our openness, our comfort, you know, not everything's perfect in terms of race in Britain, but it is a reflection of our openness and comfort with race that this moment is even possible. But I think he would argue that that doesn't presuppose or predetermine any of his political beliefs. He's free to think and decide what he wants to. But yes, a moment of history, and certainly one that my parents would never have imagined when they came here in the 60s.
That's the thing, and I think that that's one of the reasons why, you know, I'm keen to talk about this element today, which is that there'll be lots of people watching who came to this country possibly back in the 60s, let's say, or even before then. I know some families from British Asian families who go back to the 70s, so they're more recent still. They can't quite believe it's happening. Yeah. In one case, you know, they're solid Labour people. They're certainly not Conservatives, but a big part of them is rather pleased that this is being recognised and that there's no fuss about it, that there's no kind of debate about that. It may sound a rather odd thing to say.
So in a funny way, we shouldn't really be talking about it.
It's a weird thing.
Can't help but
I just think it's worth noting.
It is worth noting.
It's a very important thing to note because it says something about the way society has changed. And there was one distinguished commentator yesterday saying that, you know, there's no shortage of resentment in parts of the country at immigrants. There's no shortage of resentment in terms of the mix. That still exists. But that doesn't mean to say that society hasn't changed enormously over the last 50 years. And today is part of that change.
It's a symbol.
Yeah. It's true. Nick Eardley, our chief political correspondent, is with us as well. And Nick, we're just really just hanging on these images here, not just because they're nice images, they look rather good, but we'll see when Rishi Sunak leaves the palace, and then we'll follow the car back here to Downing Street, because we'll then be, of course, in our familiar crouching position, Nick, as we wait for the speech to be delivered. I'm just wondering, from your point of view now, what does Rishi Sunak need to say in the statement today when he comes here, which wasn't said yesterday? I'm not being unkind. I think yesterday was rather businesslike, and it was delivered in a kind of fairly monotone voice. Surely today there needs to be more in terms of vision, The tone possibly needs to be different. What is your checklist?
I think that's right. So I don't expect Rishi Sunak to have supporters in the street. He will break with that tradition of having his allies clapping him in. And the view in his team is that this is a serious time, not one for celebration. And I think that is ultimately going to be reflected in what we hear from the new Prime Minister in his first speech here in Downing Street. Now, there is no doubt that he will repeat what he said yesterday, that these are trying economic times. And I think he will try and prepare the ground for what we're expecting from the government over the next 10 days or so, which are some pretty tough economic decisions. Now, the argument that the Chancellor has made, the current Chancellor anyway, is that you're going to have to cut spending and that you're going to have to raise some taxes to plug the fiscal black hole. And I think that is going to be at the crux of what Mr. Sunak says. He has to prepare the country for what he thinks are bound to be tough economic times, and for a massive debate, actually, about what should be cut from public spending, if anything, what taxes need to go up. It's all about rolling the pitch. That's what Liz Truss was accused of not doing, not preparing everybody for just how hard and fast she was prepared to go. Mr. Sunak's going to arrive here shortly, and his job is going to be to try and set out to the country why he's doing what he's about to do.
One of the other problems, Nick, and just bear with me because I want to bring another colleague in, is of course what's happening in Northern Ireland and all of the trouble there over the protocol in Northern Ireland and trading relations with the island of, with Britain in this case, between Northern Ireland and Britain, and of course with the Republic of Ireland, which is in the EU. Now, this protocol issue still hasn't been resolved. Let's talk to our Ireland correspondent, Charlotte Gallagher, who joins us now. Charlotte, what's your thought on, first of all, can we talk about personnel, Northern Ireland Secretary? Are we likely to see a change?
We could well see a change, Hugh. So Chris Heaton-Harris, the current Northern Ireland Secretary, has said he wants to stay in the job. He feels like he's got unfinished business. Steve Baker, Northern Ireland Minister, he wants to stay too. Chris Heaton-Harris supported Boris Johnson in the early stages of this recent leadership contest and then switched to Rishi Sunak. He wants to stay, but we don't know if he will. Steve Baker, we don't know if he'll stay either. So many questions facing Northern Ireland. Julian Smith, a former Northern Ireland Secretary, he's been mentioned as possibly coming back. He was someone who was incredibly popular in Northern Ireland and managed to get on with all parties, which I'm sure you'll know is quite a feat here in Northern Ireland. Secondly, we're now looking at whether there will be an election to Stormont called on Friday. You've mentioned the protocol there. Essentially, there hasn't been a fully functioning government here, devolved government, since February. The Democratic Unionist Party are refusing to go back to Stormont until the protocol, the trading arrangements post-Brexit, are either significantly altered or scrapped altogether. The deadline is this Friday for all parties to return to Stormont. It would take a miracle for that to happen, for the DUP to go back to Stormont at this point. They're saying they want words, not and actions. They don't want promises. So we're looking that an election will be called on Friday here. Chris Heaton-Harris has said it'll definitely happen, but of course he might be out of a job by then. Steve Baker has said this is an area where the government won't U-turn, but we know, of course, that they have U-turned in the past. So it's possible if there's a new Northern Ireland Secretary, they might choose to implement a delay so it wouldn't be called on Friday. But so many questions here, and people, like everywhere in the UK, are facing a cost of living crisis. They want healthcare sorted, public transport, education. But because there isn't this functioning devolved government, those things aren't really being dealt with as they should be.
Charlotte, many thanks. We're just going to hold it there for a second. I want to put some of those points to Jessica Parker, our colleague in Brussels, and to ask you, Jessica, really how you think the EU is looking at the prospect of a Sunak premiership in terms of trying to resolve these really difficult issues around that Northern Ireland protocol.
I think initially, certainly during the summer leadership contest, when it was down to Rishi Sunak versus Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak probably, if you spoke to officials and diplomats privately, was the preferred candidate. There was a sense that as the former Chancellor And also there were reports that he'd sort of warned of the potential economic impact of a trade war with Europe if the protocol dispute escalated. They thought that he would probably take what's often termed here a more pragmatic approach. And I think there is still a sense in terms of welcoming a Rishi Sunak premiership in that way. But also that's tempered by the fact as well that I think some people here also look at the Conservative Party and think pressure from the right of the party, the Eurosceptic wing of the party, will still apply to Rishi Sunak in terms of making any compromises over trying to fix those problems with post-Brexit trading arrangements for Northern Ireland. But the other thing to mention as well is he's a relatively unknown quantity here. So Boris Johnson, of course, he used to work here as a journalist in Brussels, a Brexit poster boy as well. Liz Truss, before she became Prime Minister, was the Foreign Secretary, so relatively well known in international circles. Rishi Sunak, more of an unknown quantity here for people, but they're certainly watching with interest, if not fascination. Certainly over the last few weeks, people have been observing what's happening with British politics with some quite substantial interest. And I would say that jaws dropped to the floor late last week as news emerged of the possible return of Boris Johnson. They were pretty relieved, I think, here to see that that didn't actually turn out to be the case in the end.
OK, Jessica, thank you very much for the reading there for us on the position in Brussels. Jessica Parker for us there, our correspondent. And back here in central London, I think we are probably fairly close to the end of this audience which the King is giving the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. It's now 11:30, so my guess is that the audience will be coming to an end fairly soon. Nick Eardley is still with me, and we're just going to be waiting now for the departure of Rishi Sunak from the palace and then the journey back to Downing Street, and of course the opening statement as Prime Minister when Mr Sunak arrives here. This initial audience with the King, of course the King will have met Mr Sunak many times before, but this initial audience will be interesting in setting the tone of their relationship. Nicholas Witchell, our royal correspondent, is keeping an eye on things at the palace. What are your thoughts there, Nick, on timings and other things?
Sorry, which shot? They went in at 11:07, so the audience has been taking place for 23, 24 minutes. So I agree with you. I think any moment now we should be seeing the Sunaks leaving Buckingham Palace as Prime Minister with his wife Akshata Murty. They went in, as I say, greeted by both Sir Clive Alderton, the King's Private Secretary, and Sir Edward Young, who was Private Secretary to Queen Elizabeth and who is still there in an advisory role assisting the new King. And I'm sure that it is a matter of particular satisfaction to King Charles, presiding over his first appointment of a Prime Minister, that Prime Minister should be someone of Indian origin, the first Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of colour, a man who the King certainly knows well from his time as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and I think that will be a matter of satisfaction to the King, given how much, as Prince of Wales, he demonstrated his commitment to multiculturalism and diversity, particularly diversity of faith. He made an important statement about that a couple of days after he became king to religious leaders. He said that he wanted to be sovereign of all communities. And there is, of course, now the prospect that at his coronation in May, the British Prime Minister will be a practicing Hindu. And that, I think, says a lot about the multiculturalism and the diversity of the United Kingdom, and I think that will be something that pleases the King. So we can assume that by now we do have a new Prime Minister, albeit that we haven't yet had a sight of him. But I would imagine that in the next few minutes we will see Prime Minister Sunak leaving Buckingham Palace to make his way with his wife back to Downing Street to make that much anticipated statement at the lectern, which is now standing in front of the gates of Downing Street. So that's where we are now. It's 11:33, so he's running a little bit behind schedule. But yes, I'm quite sure that there will have been a serious conversation between the new Prime Minister and the new King, exercising, as I was mentioning earlier, his right to be consulted, to encourage and to warn, and King Charles will want to know the kind of direction of travel that his new Prime Minister intends to take and how he intends to set about the pressing and huge, particularly economic issues, together with those issues in which the King takes a particular interest. Of course, the environment, the upcoming conference in Egypt, that COP27, that the King will have a particular interest in. But overwhelming all of those issues, obviously, is the economic dilemma, the economic challenge that will now be first and foremost on the agenda of the new Prime Minister as he prepares to return to Downing Street to take up residence there.
Nick, I think with any luck we may have an image from the audience which has taken place in the past few minutes. There we have it. There's the greeting. There's King Charles greeting the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. Very warm image, nice smiles all round as the invitation is extended to Mr Sunak to form the next government. And Nick Eardley is with me, and that's an image that does express warmth, I think, doesn't it?
I think that's true. I think that's absolutely right. A big moment for both of them. This is a first time for both of them overseeing this transfer of power. The new King, this is his first Prime Minister that he's appointing. This is Rishi Sunak's first time at Buckingham Palace, about to become the UK's Prime Minister, the UK's 57th Prime Minister, no less. But yes, you can see they both look quite comfortable in that situation, don't they?
So this is the scene from Buckingham Palace just a few moments ago. It's now 25 to 12. This happened about 10 minutes ago during the audience, which, as Nicholas Witchell was suggesting there, is probably just about at an end now, if it's not ended already. They've been very efficient getting that image out from the initial greeting, and there's the confirmation that Mr Sunak has been formally appointed as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The youngest Prime Minister in 200 years and the first Prime Minister of Indian origin. So it's a big day on many counts, but no one is underestimating the scale of the challenge facing Mr Sunak after the turbulence and the mistakes that have been admitted by government in the past few weeks. So it's a turbulent time. The sun may be shining, but economically it's quite a gloomy forecast, and there are decisions to be made which will affect millions of households up and down the country, with people feeling a lot of concern and a lot of alarm about the rising cost of living and indeed the rising cost of fuel. So the decisions, certainly very difficult. So behind the smiles and behind the warmth and behind the greetings, a lot of concern about what this new government of Rishi Sunak, it's of course the same Conservatives in power, but a new government under a new Prime Minister in that sense, will have to do, and the decisions that will have to be taken. Because one senses, Nick Eardley, that these smiles will of course be adorning lots of newspaper front pages tomorrow and all kinds of media, but once the meetings start in Downing Street later on today, there'll be few smiles around. It'll be down to business.
I think that's right. I mean, this is a huge moment of political triumph for Rishi Sunak, given that 7 weeks ago it looked like he had been cast into the political wilderness. But my understanding is when we hear from him in the next 10 minutes or so, it will be quite a sombre message that Rishi Sunak wants to tell the country the difficult economic times are ahead. We won't see the usual scenes we've got used to in Downing Street, where new Prime Ministers have their supporters there to applaud them in. Rishi Sunak wants to portray this as a sombre, serious time where he's going to take the economic challenges that the UK is about to face extremely seriously. We heard him warn over the summer, didn't we, at great length about some of the fears he had about inflation, about some of the fears he had about balancing the books. He has to make political choices now. They are political choices to potentially cut spending, to potentially increase tax. But what we're going to hear from him, I think, in the next few minutes is his outline for power, some optimism, yes, there's always optimism from new Prime Ministers, but also that message that this is a serious time and it needs to be taken seriously.
Well, we're talking about challenges, we're talking about policy decisions, we're talking about relations between Mr Sunak and other leaders. We've had a word with our colleagues in Brussels. We spoke earlier to Regini in Delhi. Yesterday, the First Minister of Scotland was making the point that she wanted a constructive working relationship with Mr Sunak. Bear in mind that during the 49 days of the premiership of Liz Truss, there was no contact between the First Minister of Scotland, the First Minister of Wales and the Prime Minister, which I think everyone can agree is, let's just say, something that we don't quite expect in terms of a new Prime Minister coming to power would be expected to talk to the administrations in Edinburgh and Cardiff and in Belfast. So clearly there was some tension there. That will probably change, but it remains to be seen to what extent. James Shaw is our colleague in Glasgow, talking about the kind of prospects for better relations, James, between Downing Street under Mr Sunak and Nicola Sturgeon's government there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting, Hugh. You mentioned the fact that there was no conversation at all between Liz Truss and Nicola Sturgeon. She had actually said, she had warned that she was going to effectively ignore the First Minister of Scotland, clearly the leading political figure in this nation, and that's exactly what she did. But at the time, Rishi Sunak warned or said he thought that that would be dangerously complacent. And so now, I guess we would expect him to put that into effect. We would expect there to be certainly a different tone, I think, to the relationship between the new Prime Minister and the First Minister of Scotland, bearing in mind she has been First Minister of Scotland for 8 years. As Rishi Sunak arrives, that will be the 5th Prime Minister of the UK that she will seek to have a constructive working relationship with, as she puts it. So I think the tone could possibly change. Perhaps there will be an early conversation between the two, but the fundamentals are probably not going to change significantly. I think it is fair to say that Rishi Sunak is as opposed to the idea of a second independence referendum as any of the other people, the other occupants of number 10 Downing Street in the last few years. In fact, he's described the idea of a vote during a cost of living crisis as balmy. So that gives you a sense of how he sees it. And I think he's also, perhaps finally, Hugh, going to be more active in his relationship with Scotland, in scrutinising what the Scottish Government has been doing for the last many years that it has been in power. There's a sense, I think, from him that they have stayed in power, that their record has not been fully interrogated. And I think that is one of the things that he will seek to do in amongst all those other huge tasks that he has on his desk this morning.
James, thanks very much for explaining some of the dynamics of that relationship to us and how they might or might not change. It is, of course, crucial, the relationship between Downing Street and Edinburgh and Cardiff in terms of the way that governments function and the shared responsibilities that they have. So the way that develops will be watched very closely indeed. We're back in central London, and this is the scene around the Queen Victoria Memorial. We've just seen other troopers of the Household Cavalry, the Blues and Royals, making their way along Constitution Hill back towards their headquarters, their barracks in Knightsbridge, I suspect, past Wellington Arch, and all of these areas, of course, very familiar from the day of Her Majesty's funeral back in September, because this was where the London part of the ceremonial came to an end at Wellington Arch, which is just beyond Buckingham Palace there, just along to the right-hand side. It is now just turned 20 to 12, so if that audience is still going on, well, it's a very long audience. I suspect that the audience has come to an end now, but maybe there are just a few officials to be spoken to. As soon as the car leaves, we'll see it, because it'll come out of the main carriageway and main carriage gates past the memorial and along the Mall again. That's what I suspect anyway, unless they've got some unusual route in mind. So we should have a good view of the new Prime Minister as he leaves Buckingham Palace, making his way to Downing Street. I think at the moment we're running about 8 minutes later than we were kind of expecting, because we thought Mr. Sunak would be here at about 25 to 12, but it's now nearly 1:45. It's 43, so some 8 minutes late. Nick Eardley is with me, and we're both waiting now, Nick, aren't we, for that moment when the gates of Downing Street open and when the outriders with their flashing lights approach, and then we'll know, because the lectern is there already, the podium is there, we'll know exactly what's going on. So I suspect we don't have too long to wait. The work on the statement, which will be delivered, of course, was done, lots of it, yesterday. And now there we have the images of the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, at 42 years of age, the youngest Prime Minister in the UK since Lord Liverpool back in 1812. The Queen's Private Secretary and other members of the household, and Mr. Sunak's wife, who's accompanied him as well, they are ready now to leave the palace and go back to number 10. Whether Mr. Sunak's wife will be with him when they come here, I'm not sure, but anyway, we'll see.
Not as far to come as last time
No,
when we were
no.
travelling down from Aberdeenshire.
No.
And it's a fascinating moment, because in the 2 minutes or so it takes to drive back here, Rishi Sunak will be thinking about the biggest political speech of his life so far. I'm told he finished it off this morning. Such is the pace of this leadership campaign that we didn't even know for sure this time yesterday whether Rishi Sunak was going to be Prime Minister, but he has this short drive back to Downing Street now where he has to mull over those words, which are going to be so important in defining his premiership. As I say, I would expect him to address the seriousness of the economic situation. I don't think it will be particularly celebratory, as we've seen from some Prime Ministers in recent years. I think he will want to strike a more sombre tone and try and set out what he will pitch as some of the hard decisions coming.
So Mr. Sunak is on the move, leaving the quadrangle, the heart of Buckingham Palace. The outriders leading the way, the central gates are open, and the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is on his way to Downing Street. Some applause from the crowd who've gathered there outside the palace. Cars making their way around the memorial and then along the Mall. So it's the same route that they took to come down to the palace earlier. And it is certainly the quickest route and the most direct one. So Mr. Sunak now making his way to Downing Street, where he will be meeting the Cabinet Secretary and other senior officials inside Downing Street. Will be given a security briefing as soon as he's inside, and then they will sit down to get on with the task of forming his government. He'll have thought in great detail, of course, about who he wants in the main jobs. So it'll be a matter of making contact with some of them and in one or two cases possibly persuading people, in others giving them news that they certainly wanted, and in one or two cases, of course, telling people that they're no longer required. So it's a process that can take several hours, but I'd imagine that it won't be long before we get some of the first and the key appointments. And I'd have thought, Nick, that just in terms of stability and the markets and all the rest of it, he might want to be clarifying the role of Chancellor fairly quickly.
I think that's right, and my assumption is that Jeremy Hunt stays as Chancellor, not confirmed yet by Mr. Sunak's team, but that has been the assumption over the last 24 hours or so. There may be some other changes in big jobs, though, that Rishi Sunak has been weighing up this morning. We may see some new cabinet ministers walking up this famous street this afternoon to get into their jobs, because Mr. Sunak wants to do two things. Yes, he wants some of his allies around the cabinet table, but he also has made a big thing about uniting his party, about trying to bring in different parts of the Conservative Party to unite them, to say this isn't just about bringing in people who will be loyal to me, but it's about reflecting different views at the very top of the Conservative Party.
So here we are. We are seeing the approach now to Downing Street. The new Prime Minister on his way. Very shortly will be in Downing Street. Past some of the government offices. The gates have now been opened wide, and we're expecting Rishi Sunak to drive into Downing Street any moment. And of course, when he arrives, he'll be ready to make the statement at the podium which has been erected here. So a very familiar route, and the gates are now opening. Vicky Young is watching for us too, and Vicky underlining the fact here that Mr. Sunak is going to have a very big message to deliver.
Yeah, that's right. I'm in the House of Commons and have been chatting to people for, the last hour or so. And what's really interesting is about the team he's going to put around him. And very unusually, even those very close to him I've spoken to say he has made no promises to anybody. Everyone is in the dark, even those who have spent a lot of time with him over the last few weeks. Now, that's probably a different approach. Lots of people thought he would be maybe giving hints here and there. Hermetically sealed, someone has said to me, as this process has been. Even to the point where Penny Mordaunt, of course, his rival, hasn't been offered a specific job. She, of course, left it very late to drop out. But also lots of those people saying, actually, that's the right thing to do. He's going to make his decisions
Vicky.
about who he wants.
Here's the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, approaching with his opening statement of his premiership.
Good morning. Good morning. I've just been to Buckingham Palace and accepted His Majesty the King's invitation to form a government in his name. It is only right to explain why I'm standing here as your new Prime Minister. Right now, our country is facing a profound economic crisis. The aftermath of COVID still lingers. Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets and supply chains the world over. I want to pay tribute to my predecessor, Liz Truss. She was not wrong to want to improve growth in this country. It is a noble aim. And I admired her restlessness to create change. But some mistakes were made. Not born of ill will or bad intentions. Quite the opposite, in fact. But mistakes nonetheless. And I have been elected as leader of my party and your Prime Minister, in part, to fix them. And that work begins immediately. I will place economic stability and confidence at the heart of this government's agenda. This will mean difficult decisions to come. But you saw me during COVID doing everything I could to protect people and businesses with schemes like furlough. There are always limits, more so now than ever. But I promise you this, I will bring that same compassion to the challenges we face today. The government I lead will not leave the next generation, your children and grandchildren, with a debt to settle that we were too weak to pay ourselves. I will unite our country, not with words, but with action. I will work day in and day out to deliver for you. This government will have integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level. Trust is earned, and I will earn yours. I will always be grateful to Boris Johnson for his incredible achievements as Prime Minister, and I treasure his warmth and generosity of spirit. And I know he would agree that the mandate my party earned in 2019 is not the sole property of any one individual. It is a mandate that belongs to and unites all of us. And the heart of that mandate is our manifesto. I will deliver on its promise: a stronger NHS, better schools, safer streets, control of our borders, protecting our environment, supporting our armed forces, levelling up, and building an economy that embraces the opportunities of Brexit, where businesses invest, innovate, and create jobs. I understand how difficult this moment is. After the billions of pounds it cost us to combat COVID, after all the dislocation that caused, in the midst of a terrible war that must be seen successfully to its conclusions, I fully appreciate how hard things are. And I understand too that I have work to do to restore trust after all that has happened. All I can say is that I am not daunted. I know the high office I have accepted, and I hope to live up to its demands. But when the opportunity to serve comes along, you cannot question the moment, only your willingness. So I stand here before you, ready to lead our country into the future, to put your needs above politics, to reach out and build a government that represents the very best traditions of my party. Together, we can achieve incredible things. We will create a future worthy of the sacrifices so many have made, and fill tomorrow and every day thereafter with hope. Thank you.
So the statement by Mr. Sunak, saying he's not daunted by the enormous task ahead of him, now posing for the traditional photo on the threshold of power, on the threshold of number 10 Downing Street, Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury at the age of 42, the youngest Prime Minister of the UK for 200 years, and the first British Asian to achieve the highest office. A statement, one of confidence, one of determination, but insisting that he does understand the pressure that people are feeling out there. Enters number 10 as Prime Minister, with a big round of applause from civil servants and officials and advisors in that traditional way, lining the corridor all the way down to the Cabinet room to greet the new Prime Minister. Nick Eardley is still with me. And Nick, what did you make of the statement?
Never before have we seen a Prime Minister arrive and seek to so quickly draw a line under their predecessor's reign. Clear that Rishi Sunak wanted to say there, Liz Truss got some serious things wrong and I'm determined to fix them. He was very open about what he thinks the economic challenges coming are, some of the phrases he used, again, about a profound economic challenge. And I thought he tried to address the complaint we're going to get a lot from opposition parties and from some of his own MPs about his mandate, because he said quite clearly there that he believes the 2019 mandate that the Conservatives got belonged to everyone, not just to Boris Johnson. And he's trying to say, I'm going to deliver what we promised at that election. But also from the new Prime Minister, a flavour of how difficult he thinks things are going to be, talking about how hard the economic picture is, about those difficult decisions to come, and I think setting up that economic statement next week, which is going to see spending cuts and tax rises.
Well, we're here in Downing Street, and we've just had that statement from Rishi Sunak, the UK's new Prime Minister. The world's media gathered, everyone snapping away with the cameras, of course, and listening to every single word of that. And among the crowd, Chris Mason, with us too, our political editor. And Chris, from your point of view, what were the things that he underlined in that statement that were for you the most telling, the most significant in terms of his intentions?
For me, the most striking thing, before we even look at the language, was his tone. Yeah. His tone, so striking, in contrast with what came before. There wasn't the defiance, if you like, that we heard from Liz Truss in her departing address. Instead, in the language that he chose in just those opening few words, a recognition of the economic climate, a recognition too, a sort of knowing recognition that so many in the country have looked in on what's been going on in this postcode in the last 5 or 6 weeks in despair at the chaos that has unfolded within government, and that has had profound consequences for the popularity of the Conservative Party. But more importantly than that, for so many people's concerns about their own economic welfare, their own mortgages, their own capacity to look in on government and think that it has its interests at heart and knows what it's doing. So I think tone was really important from the new Prime Minister, but then also delivered in his own way, his own brand of defiance, as Nick was reflecting on there, a determination to, yes, say that he will try and deliver the 2019 election manifesto, which is the basis for the Conservative majority in Parliament, but also directly detach the idea that that was Boris Johnson's mandate, and instead say, look, this is a Conservative mandate and I'm the new head of the shop. That was very explicit in the way that he said that. So he didn't say explicitly in the way that he had yesterday in his address to Conservative MPs that there wouldn't be an election anytime soon, but he said it without having to use that language, that he says, look, constitutionally I have legitimacy. But there was also, I thought, in his references to, if you like, his own political biography, not least the furlough scheme and his role as Chancellor during the pandemic, of him introducing himself to the country. Because not unreasonably, plenty of people over the summer may not have paid him all that much attention during that Conservative leadership race, not least because people might have better things to do over the summer, but also because he was the runner-up for so much of that, or the expected runner-up for so much of that contest. People were more likely to be paying attention to the likely new Prime Minister at the time in Liz Truss. So we saw there, and I think we'll see it again in the coming days, a sense of him introducing himself to the country, because not unreasonably, people might look in on proceedings this morning and ask questions about who he is and what his priorities will be and what his style will be. As I say, tonally, I thought that style so markedly different from either his immediate predecessor or the very near immediate predecessor before of Boris Johnson.
Well, it was very different to the style yesterday.
Yeah, it was.
Very different.
He was reading from paper as opposed to from an auto cue, perhaps something in that. No doubt he'll have picked up on some of the criticisms made on his own side as well as more broadly about the nature of his delivery in front of the camera yesterday. It felt more authentically him, and he felt much more, he sounded much more comfortable and much more natural. But again, on a human level, we should reflect that it's only 5 days ago that Liz Truss was here in front of her own lectern announcing her resignation. So this has been politics on a new kind of fast forward, even compared with what we've talked about in recent weeks, that he had to decide whether he was going to stand, decide what his pitch would be, speak to hundreds of Conservative MPs to try and persuade them, and then in the blink of an eye decide what his opening pitch to the country would be, all in the space of less than a week.
Hang on a second, because I think we can see a comment from Boris Johnson. Here we are. Congratulations to Rishi Sunak on this historic day. This is the moment for every Conservative to give our new PM their full and wholehearted support. Well, that's a generous message from Boris Johnson, as I'm sure he would see it, given that Prime Minister actually was making some rather generous comments about Mr Johnson as well. So there's a bit of mutual backslapping going on.
Yeah, generosity does tend to spring out at moments like this between political leaders and former political leaders. And Boris Johnson, if I remember rightly, bashed out a similar tweet 7 weeks ago when Liz Truss began, suggesting that the party should offer her 100% support. Didn't quite turn out that way, and we know of the tensions that have existed between Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson. Of course, Rishi Sunak's resignation, one of those things that brought about the end of the Boris Johnson era. I think Mr Sunak has always worn quite heavily that accusation that he was somehow, some kind of, to put it bluntly, some sort of political backstabber. It was his view that he had just reached the point where he couldn't defend the Boris Johnson administration anymore. But there's no doubt that perception, fair or otherwise, of Mr Sunak caused him damage in the race against Liz Truss over the summer. Without question, that was a problem.
A point that, I mean, both of you may want to say something, but Chris, just in terms of the mandate, I'm fascinated by this point because, of course, you know, you've had lots of people saying, and we'll be talking to Annalise Dodds from Labour in a second, people making a case for a general election. You know, people making a case for millions of voters having a say in who the Prime Minister is. And it's interesting that today the tack was different, as you say. He wanted to talk about the validity of the mandate for the party.
Yes.
And the party's representatives at Westminster, who, as he would put it, happen to have chosen him now to lead them to become Prime Minister, and trying to distance himself from the argument for an election. Will that argument be enough for him to stave off these, I mean, he's clearly not going to give an election, but to stave off the kind of increasing demands that are there?
So, to the extent that, to address your point directly and what you were just reflecting on there, he holds the power. He and/or a majority in Parliament hold the power on bringing a Parliament to a premature conclusion relative to its legal end and bringing about a general election. So you're going to hear the clamour from opposition parties, not least because so many of our opposition parties at Westminster now are very competitive. You look at where Labour is in the opinion polls, you look at the revival of the Liberal Democrats, you look at the ongoing dominance of the Scottish National Party in Scotland, and you look at the Conservative opinion polls, which are at incredibly low levels by any modern comparison. So they will continue to make that argument. And they have, of course, a political argument to make because they can say, look, hang on, the Conservatives were elected under a Prime Minister, not even the last one, the one before that. But we should make the point that you only have to look to recent history. Gordon Brown became Prime Minister between elections, so did Theresa May, so did Boris Johnson, so did Liz Truss, and so did Rishi Sunak. Now, in Theresa May and Boris Johnson's terms, they both then fought elections and formed governments after those elections. The others didn't. So there's plenty of modern precedents where Prime Ministers in a parliamentary democracy assume office between elections. But that doesn't mean they don't face big legitimacy questions. And Rishi Sunak knows that, and it's exactly why he sought to address it.
Let's stop for a second, Nick, because I want to bring in Annalise Dodds. We'll come back. Annalise Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor, of course, and now Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities in the UK, member of the Shadow Cabinet. Annalise, good of you to talk to us. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. So can we tackle the legitimacy question straight away? Because so many of your colleagues have been really underlining this point. What's your answer to the new Prime Minister's case today that, you know, the mandate is his party's mandate and therefore there is no question about the need for an election?
Well, that's wrong, because Rishi Sunak is saying he's the answer when the problem ultimately is the Conservatives. I mean, Rishi Sunak has been part of those 12 years of Conservative failure, and people didn't vote at the last election for a high-tax, low-growth economy. But of course, Rishi Sunak was right at the heart of that. So we're not seeing the change that's needed for our country with this coronation of Rishi Sunak. Quite the opposite. He doesn't have a mandate, and we need a fresh start with a general election.
So let me just be blunt. You're not likely to get a general election. Even if you make the case repeatedly, it's very unlikely to happen. Which then brings us to another question, which is, How do you then take the fight as an opposition? You're doing very well in the polls at the moment. How do you maintain that now that you have a new figure who will want to portray himself as a new start?
Well, ultimately, of course, Sunak is not a new start. He has presided over that economic failure. He's been right at the heart of those failing Conservative governments. And it's ordinary people, of course, who are paying the price. I mean, many people looking towards Monday, what seems to be setting up as a real kind of Halloween horror show of a fiscal statement likely to be coming from the Conservatives on Monday. They're really worried about their mortgages, they're worried about the rising cost of living. And that didn't just happen yesterday, that's been built up over those 12 years of Conservative failure. And Rishi Sunak's been at the heart of it. You know, Labour is setting out something very different to what Rishi Sunak is talking about. I know he didn't set out any proposals in his speech to obtain the growth that we need as a country. Labour set out our Green Prosperity Plan, really clear measures that we should be taking right now to get growth going again in our country, up and down our country, generate those new jobs that we need and have the energy security we need to get people's bills down. We didn't see any content from Rishi Sunak, and we're going to be pushing very hard for that, because ultimately that's what would make the difference to ordinary people.
There is meant to be, as you know, this fiscal statement by the Chancellor next week, next Monday. Do you think that should still go ahead? Or do you think that there should be a rethink of some of the elements that we've been familiar with so far to give the government, maybe this government under Rishi Sunak, more time to think about how they repair some of the damage of the past few weeks?
Well, Labour set out measures that could be taken right now, and the government should listen to what Labour has set out. For example, around the windfall tax, of course, Rishi Sunak, only after many, many months of lobbying, not just from Labour, but also from many different organisations representing ordinary families, also from businesses, eventually Sunak put a version of the windfall tax on the books, but one that was riddled with holes and one which hasn't ultimately been ensuring that the cost of energy in the future for families will be kept down. So he could and should be taking measures right now, again, those measures to promote growth that Labour set out in our Green Prosperity Plan. But I didn't see any indication, I have to say, in his comments just now, that he is going to be setting out those concrete plans. In fact, we've seen our country going in the wrong direction under the Conservatives towards that high tax, low growth economy, and Sunak has been at the heart of that.
Annalise Dodds, good of you to join us. Thanks very much, and no doubt we'll hear more from you in the days to come. Annalise Dodds there for Labour. Nick Eardley and Chris Mason are still with me. I should correct one thing, Chris, because earlier when we saw Mr. Sunak arriving at Downing Street, accompanied by, now turns out, a female colleague, a parliamentary private secretary. So if Akshata Murthy is watching, I'm sorry, we couldn't quite see the image clearly enough. So at least we've cleared that up. And interestingly, of course, Mr. Sunak decided that he would enter Downing Street alone and with no family.
Yes, and I think that speaks to a part of the image he's actually keen to project today.
Yeah.
That he did not want this to be seen as a moment of personal triumph, although of course it is. This wasn't a moment to have the family in tow. This was a business-like address from the very moment he arrived, and quite strikingly actually, as I was just watching him on the step posing for the photographers who were very keen to try and get him to smile, not unreasonable from a photographer's point of view. I think he was reluctant to do that because I think he recognises, he said this yesterday to Conservative MPs, these are his words, not mine, that the country has faced an economic and political crisis. Now, a political crisis somewhat brought about by his own party under his predecessor, and an economic crisis that she inherited and did her best to try and grapple with, and which he now inherits. So I think it's not unreasonable to assume in these situations that someone accompanying a new Prime Minister may have a spouse in tow, but it speaks to, I think, an intention on his part to project a very particular image, knowing that these images will be shared globally, and knowing that whether it be in the financial markets just a few miles away in the city or around the world, brand Britain on the global stage, which people in government acknowledge has taken something of a battering in the last couple of weeks, that these are the images that will be shared, and projecting that sense of a business-like sense of purpose really important.
So brand Britain, of course, depends on partly the people who represent us and in these great offices. You're both going to hate me now. I'm going to say your nomination for Chancellor is?
Jeremy Hunt.
And Home Secretary?
It's a harder question. Maybe Grant Shapps, maybe Dominic Raab.
OK, and then, of course, we're left with Foreign Secretary.
What do you reckon, Chris? I'll leave that one to
well,
you.
Foreign Secretary, very interesting. So, does the new Prime Minister want to find a big office of state? We've talked about the other two, and Foreign Secretary is the third of those, for Penny Mordaunt, who has been very much in the mix of the Conservative conversation over the last few months.
We'll take that.
Or,
yes.
Or does he leave James Cleverly in post because he was a supporter of Boris Johnson as recently as Sunday? And
well, we'll see.
A government of all the Conservative
We will see. We're out of time. And thank you all for watching. More on the news later, of course. But thanks for watching, and bye for now.